For decades, people believed Johnny Carson's earliest shows were simply gone, erased without a trace. But then, a forgotten film reel surfaced in a military archive containing footage nobody had seen since it originally aired. It wasn't hidden in a vault or protected as a secret. It survived because someone failed to destroy it. That discovery raised an uncomfortable question. If this much history disappeared, what else is still missing? And why was it allowed to vanish in the first place? The discovery that changed everything. The story doesn't begin with a scandal. It begins with a mistake. Inside a military storage facility connected to the Defense Imagery Management Operations Center, archivists were sorting through boxes that had been moved, forgotten, and relocated over the years. These were not carefully curated collections. They were leftovers, materials that had slipped through the cracks during multiple transitions of the American Forces Network Broadcast Center. Among those boxes, a retired program support manager named Mary K.S. came across something unusual. It wasn't labeled as valuable. It wasn't marked for preservation. It was simply a reel of film sitting in a place where it didn't belong. But when she looked closely, she immediately recognized what she was holding. Footage from The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson dating back to the early years of the program. That moment mattered more than it seemed because at that time almost nothing from those early years was believed to still exist. Carson had taken over as host in the early 60s, and his show quickly became a nightly ritual for millions of Americans. Yet, despite its cultural impact, the majority of those early broadcasts had vanished. The reel was eventually handed over to Jeff Satzing, Carson's nephew and the CEO of Carson Entertainment Group. When he saw the footage, he understood immediately how rare it was. These clips contained opening monologues and interviews that had not been viewed since the night they originally aired. There were no reruns, no home recordings, no digital backups. This was the first time anyone had seen them in decades. What makes this discovery even more striking is how accidental it was. The reel was never meant to survive. According to those familiar with the system, most materials like this were either returned, reused, or destroyed after serving their purpose. The only reason this one remained is because it was overlooked. And that raises the first uncomfortable truth in this story. This wasn't a hidden archive waiting to be uncovered. It was a piece of history that survived by pure chance, sitting in the wrong place long enough to avoid being erased. That realization changes how we look at the idea of lost episodes. Because if something this significant could be forgotten so easily, then the real story isn't about one missing show. It's about how an entire era of television nearly disappeared without anyone stopping it. The industry practice that erased a generation. To understand why so much of Johnny Carson's early work disappeared, you have to step back into how television actually operated at the time. This wasn't an era of preservation. It was an era of efficiency, cost-cutting, and short-term thinking. Networks were not building archives for the future. They were producing content for a single broadcast window. And once that moment passed, the material was considered expendable. Videotape was expensive and storage space was limited. As a result, networks routinely reused tapes by recording new programs over old ones. This wasn't a rare decision or a controversial one. It was standard practice across the entire industry. Shows that today would be considered cultural landmarks were treated as temporary content, no different from a daily newspaper that would be discarded the next morning. In the case of The Tonight Show, this practice had devastating consequences. Night after night, Carson delivered monologues, interviews, and unscripted moments that shaped American entertainment. But once those episodes aired, many of them were wiped clean to make room for the next broadcast. There was no expectation that audiences would ever want to revisit them because at the time there was no system that allowed them to. Jeff Satz later confirmed just how extensive the loss was. When he spoke about the early years of the show, he made it clear that almost everything from that period had vanished. Not because it was hidden, not because it was controversial, but because it had simply been recorded over. Entire months, even years of programming were effectively erased, leaving behind only fragments that had survived under unusual circumstances. The Armed Forces radio and television service played an unexpected role in this story. They would receive copies of television programs and distribute them to service members stationed around the world. These copies were often recorded using a process called kinescope, where a camera captured the broadcast directly from a monitor. After the material was used, it would typically be returned or destroyed. Occasionally, though, something would be left behind. That is exactly what happened with the Carson footage. A reel that should have been discarded instead remained in storage unnoticed for years. According to archivist Pedro Lerrero, this kind of survival was not the result of a deliberate decision to preserve history. It was the result of someone choosing not to follow the usual procedure, whether intentionally or by accident. What makes this even more striking is the mindset behind it. At the time, no one believed they were destroying anything important. There were no reruns, no home video market, and no cable networks looking for archival content. Television existed in the present tense. Once a show aired, its purpose was fulfilled. Johnny Carson did not know how much had been destroyed until it was too late. The most painful part of this story is that Johnny Carson himself did not fully grasp the scale of the loss until years after the damage had already been done. By the time he began looking back at his own history, the archive he assumed would be there had already been gutted. As the story has been told by people close to the Carson archive, everything changed when Carson wanted old clips pulled for a retrospective. That should have been a routine request. By then, he was not just a successful host, but one of the most powerful figures in television. He had built a show that ran night after night, shaped careers, introduced major stars to national audiences, and became part of the rhythm of American life. If anyone had reason to believe his work had been preserved, it was him. Instead, he was told that much of the material no longer existed because the tapes had been recorded over. That moment seems to have hit Carson hard. It was not simply a technical disappointment. It meant that years of performances, interviews, timing, improvisation, and cultural history had been treated as disposable. The loss was not abstract. It was personal. Those episodes documented his growth as a host, the changing tone of the country, and countless appearances by musicians, actors, comedians, and public figures who might never be captured that way again. That realization is what reportedly pushed Carson to insist that the show be archived going forward. In other words, the preservation of later Tonight Show history came only after he learned that the earlier years had already been sacrificed. This detail matters because it destroys the fantasy that there was some carefully guarded master vault all along. There wasn't. The show only began to be treated as history after history had already been erased. Jeff Satz's role adds another important layer here. He was not just a relative speaking from the outside. He worked on the show for many years, starting as a runner and eventually becoming a producer during Carson's final era. That gave him first-hand knowledge of how the program operated and how valuable even small surviving fragments could be. When he said that almost everything from the early period was gone, it carried weight because he understood both the production side and the historical side. What makes this especially haunting is the kind of show Carson hosted. Unlike scripted television, a late-night talk show lives in the moment. Its energy depends on timing, mood, chemistry, and surprise. A transcript cannot fully preserve that. A summary cannot recreate a pause before a punchline, the rhythm of a monologue, or the way Carson reacted when a guest took the conversation somewhere unexpected. When those episodes were erased, what disappeared was not just information. It was performance. That is why the recovered reel matters so much. It is not important only because it is old. It is important because it gives back something Carson himself once tried to retrieve and was told no longer existed. And once you understand that, the story becomes much more than a tale of lost media. It becomes the story of a legend discovering that the first chapters of his own career had been wiped away before he ever had the chance to protect them. Why this was never really about one episode. By the time the recovered Carson reel was examined more closely, it became obvious that the most misleading part of the entire mystery was the phrase, "lost episode." That wording sounds dramatic, but it actually understates the damage. What was discovered was not a complete buried installment sitting intact after decades of secrecy. It was a surviving fragment from a much larger body of work that had almost entirely disappeared. And once that became clear, the focus shifted from one reel to a much bigger question. How do you lose so much of one of the most important shows in television history? The scale is what makes the story so unsettling. Over the course of 3 decades, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson produced 4,351 episodes and featured nearly 23,000 guests. Carson won 6 Emmy Awards, a Peabody, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Kennedy Center Honors, and a place in the Television Academy Hall of Fame. This was not some obscure program that only later became valuable. It was already a central institution in American entertainment while it was on the air. Yet, despite that, the early foundation of the show was left so vulnerable that less than 1% of the material from the first major stretch of Carson's run has been accounted for. That number changes everything. It means the reel found at the military archive was not merely rare. It was statistically extraordinary. In practical terms, each surviving clip from that era is now treated almost like recovered evidence from a vanished civilization. A monologue that once aired casually into American homes is now an archival event. A conversation that was originally just another night's television now carries the weight of historical recovery. This is also where the military archive angle becomes crucial. The Defense Imagery Management Operations Center was never designed as a fan museum for classic late-night television. It was a working storage facility holding massive collections of photos, footage, and documents, including materials dating back to World War II. That means Carson's reel survived not because entertainment executives built a preservation plan around it, but because it happened to pass through an institutional system broad enough and messy enough to accidentally keep it alive. Mary K.S. understood that immediately when she found the film while sorting through overlooked boxes. Her reaction was not theatrical. It was practical and human. She knew at once that this was a gem, and she knew returning it to the Carson archive would mean something real to the family and to television history. That response matters because it highlights a painful contrast. One retired staff member recognized the value of the reel instantly, while an entire industry once treated that same material as disposable. The reel's afterlife also tells its own story. Instead of being forgotten again, the footage was slated for digital recording, transcription, and integration into Carson Entertainment Group's searchable archive. The physical film itself would be preserved in Hutchinson, Kansas, inside a former salt mine that now houses the Carson archive alongside other Hollywood materials. That detail may sound strange, but it makes perfect sense. Deep archival storage is built around stability, protection, and the assumption that these materials are worth guarding now in a way they were not before. Why the real story is more uncomfortable than any buried episode theory. By the time all the pieces are put together, the most unsettling part of this story is not what was hidden. It is what was never protected. The idea that NBC or anyone else deliberately buried a specific Johnny Carson episode suggests control, intent, and secrecy. But the truth is far less controlled and, in many ways, far more disturbing. The early history of one of television's most influential shows was not locked away. It was casually erased piece by piece under a system that never imagined it would matter later. This is why Jeff Satz's reaction to the recovered footage carries so much weight. When he spoke about the discovery, he didn't frame it as uncovering a secret. He spoke about it as recovering something that should never have been lost in the first place. He even acknowledged that Carson himself would have been thrilled to see these clips again because, during his lifetime, he had already tried to retrieve similar material and found it gone. That detail strips away the myth of hidden archives and replaces it with something more difficult to accept. Even the person at the center of it all could not access his own early work. There is also a generational gap that makes the situation more urgent. Satzing pointed out that many younger viewers do not fully understand who Johnny Carson was or why his show mattered. Without those early recordings, a significant part of that legacy becomes harder to experience directly. You can read about Carson's timing, his influence, and the way he shaped late-night television, but without the footage, you cannot fully see it. And when the material itself is missing, history becomes dependent on interpretation instead of evidence. The irony is that the system has now completely reversed. What was once erased without hesitation is now preserved with extreme care. The recovered reel is being digitized, transcribed, and integrated into a searchable archive so that it can be accessed and studied. The physical film is stored in a controlled environment designed to protect it for the long term. Every step taken now reflects an understanding that did not exist when the original tapes were being wiped. And that is where the title's underlying tension finally resolves. The fear is not about what audiences might see in a controversial episode. The real fear, if there is one, is about what audiences might realize. When people see how little remains from such a massive body of work, it forces a confrontation with how fragile cultural memory actually is. It reveals that entire chapters of entertainment history can disappear, not because they were dangerous, but because they were undervalued at the moment they existed. So, the recovered Carson footage does not expose a buried scandal. It exposes a lost foundation. It reminds us that preservation is not automatic and that even the most important voices of an era can fade if no one takes responsibility for keeping them. And perhaps the most unsettling question that remains is not about what was hidden, but about how much more has already been lost without anyone ever knowing it. So, if one forgotten reel could bring back a piece of Johnny Carson's past, how much history do you